Well, I started at the University of Huddersfield in 1971 and did more than 50 years there. I became Professor of History, then Diamond Jubilee Professor. I'm now Diamond Jubilee Professor Emeritus. In addition to that, I'm visiting Professor at York St John. I'm Associate Editor of Labour History, LABOR, an international journal, which is one of the biggest. It earns a lot of money for Taylor and Francis. And I've written or edited 50, I think it's something like 27 or 28 monographs and 22 or 3 collections. I've done lots of external examining and all sorts of things in my life, but if you look at my publications, quite a lot on Labour history, the Independent Labour Party. I've got one there which came out on the Independent Labour Party. Communist Party, the Red Flag, got 2 on the Communist Party, Under the Red Flag. General Strike, Day by Day, I've also another book on the General Strike. And I've also got an interest in working class sports and activities, going to the dogs, which is greyhound racing, of course. And of course, even though it's got the same cover, this is another different book. It's Football Pools and the British Working Class. I suddenly realised nobody really written a book properly on the football pool, so I just decided to do that. So I've written on the ILP, a centennial history of the Independent Labour Party. I've written a book on the history of British trade unionism. I've obviously written, as I've said, books on the General Strike. So that's my sort of background. Currently, I'm writing an article and a book on Eric Heffer. But we'll see where that goes, but because it's a vast topic, there's a lot of material. And I'm trying to write, but it's already at 270,000 words of documents, which I've typed up. It'll probably end up with nearly 500,000 or 600,000. I thought I'd try to explain my involvement in socialist activities in the 60s. So I thought I'd look at Trotskyist groups, non-Trotskyist Marxist groups and others. And I've titled it basically A Trot Around the Left, but how, it might take me 20 years to do that. I might well be dead before it's finished. But anyway, that's how it's. So I'm interested in trade unionism, labour, socialist histories of gambling, and I've got a book on gambling, 2 books on gambling, in fact, and other things as well. So that's the range that I've been involved in. So, and I do quite a lot of public lectures. I mean, you may not, I know the camera doesn't lie, but I am nearly 79 in 3 weeks' time. When I will be at Cheltenham Racecourse.
Yeah, well, happy birthday for that. Where would you describe yourself as coming from?
I would say that my background would be, politically, I'd be Harold Wilson Labour, which makes me pretty left-wing these days. You know, Wilson, in many ways, was to the left of Jeremy Corbyn. It's just that it was presented in a different way. So I think that's where I am. I was probably, in the old days, 60s, I'd probably be described as centre Labour. Although I did edit at Bradford University, there were a group of mathematicians who formed an IS group, International Socialist Group, and they couldn't type and they couldn't write, really. So I used to edit their material in a journal called Orbit, because the watermark on the sheet of paper, on the typing paper, but it took them right, it said Orbit. So we call it Orbit. And I did that. I did about 12 or 13 issues. I sort of typed it up, rewrote some of their stuff because it wasn't terribly good sometimes and so forth. I was at that time, of course, a member of the Labour Party. I never joined IS and I've been described many times, would you believe, as a Trotskyist. I've never been a Trotskyist in my life. But, it's usually a communist or the old communists who would, if they review something, said, this is a Trotskyist interpretation. It isn't. You know, if you criticise the Communist Party, you usually become described as a Trotskyist. So I would say politically, I'm not a member of the Labour Party. I joined it in 1964, October 1964. Harold Wilson had just got in power. And my first meeting in Barnsley was somebody turned up and said, I hope there's going to be no McDonaldism here. And I had no idea who Ramsay MacDonald was at that time. I left in 1994 when Clause 4 became something I couldn't remember. It was changed from the original. Clause 4 was never meant to be strictly interpreted in that way. It was a belief in some sort of public ownership. But now it's become some sort of commitment to liberalisation, and I'm not happy with that. Having said that, I mean, and I don't agree with Blair on many issues, I would accept that the most powerful, able politician in the West, certainly, who I've come across in the last 30 years is Tony Blair. But I disagree with him, but I can't argue against that. I mean, he's got to be, you know. Anyway, I think that's probably enough about myself, my position and whatever.
The questions, however, was specifically, when you say, I understand you explain that politically, what is your background, where you're...
Oh, sorry,
how would you describe yourself?
Well, my father was a miner. I was born in 1946 in Barnsley. My father was born about 1924 in Montbretton near Barnsley. So I was raised, well, I was born in a hospital, Beckett's Hospital, and then I was raised at Kendry for 6 months, and then we lived, until I was 60, we lived at Montbretton. And the fields between Montbretton and where we moved to Ardsley were where they did a lot of Kess. A lot of the film over Kess was done there. So I was in that area. I was a bright working class lad, but very few kids went to grammar school in Barnsley, only 8%. And so I think, I know because I was monitor, I was 12, I'd missed out on the 11 plus. The average IQ to go to university at that time was about 110. My IQ was 127, but only 8% went to Barnsley. So I did a 12 plus and I got 130. And when the new grammar school opened, so I went to the new grammar school, Broadway Technical Grammar. And it's quite a challenge in the sense that you're a working class family going into a middle class environment. Less relevant now, but certainly very relevant then. And then I went on, did A-levels, got 2 A's and a B at A-levels in the days when it was just straightforward A's and B's and not all the rest of it. At O-level, I got 85% in history, so that was where I was going to go. But GCSE these days, but it's not the same. I always remember my head teacher, Mr. Nolan. Other people, there was a middle-class lad who'd gone in to see him before. He'd got 3 C's, and he came out, he said, Mr. Nolan said, you'll go far, lad. When I went to see him, 2 A's and a B, he said, don't be too ambitious, lad. Well, I thought, I'm going to kick that. So I went to Bradford University, and then I went to Manchester for a teacher training. Well, I got the diploma of the Victoria University of Manchester. That's its official document, because it was part of the old Victoria University of Leeds, Liverpool and Manchester. And then I went on, I did an MA at Lancaster University, got a distinction in social history. And then I moved on and got a PhD at Lancaster University, and then started at Huddersfield in 71. In fact, I started there before I finished my PhD. And that's really sort of my background.
Okay.
Barnsley football is the other background, if that's of any interest to you. My grandfather and my grandmother, Laybourn, are in Montbretton Cemetery, 4 graves up from Tommy Taylor's grave. And I knew Tommy Taylor because there's a picture of me on his knee. He was brought up by his auntie and uncle, not his father and mother, in Montbretton. He was a lovely man, but killed at, age of 26, was it? Born in 1932, yeah, 26. One of the greatest footballers. Played 18 times for England, saw 16 goals. Not bad, by anybody's standard. So that's my background. I'm interested, I wouldn't say passionate, but I'm interested in football. I like sports. I'm from a working class background. I rose and the first person in my family to go to university, the first to get a degree and whatever, 3 degrees. So far, the most successful, but I think I might have some grandkids who might overtake me, you never know.
He's hoping.
He's hoping. First match was 1950, watching Barnsley against Leeds at Oakwell, and Leeds had John Charles out of the army, 18 years of age, played the army one week, and the next week they played for the home team, and Tommy Taylor. And Tommy Taylor won. He scored the goal. It shouldn't have gone in. It hit a bump in the pitch and went over the outstretched Leeds goalkeeper. So we won 1-0.
It is Leeds. You know, it's perfectly acceptable, especially as they played Sunderland earlier this week.
But Tommy Taylor was, I mean, brilliant player. I also saw in 1956 when you couldn't earn money through football. In 1956 there was a testimonial match for Arthur Kay, who played for Middlesbrough, Blackpool, Barnsley. But he, in that match, it was Barnsley and Barnsley Old Boys against Manchester United. So Tommy Taylor played the first half for Manchester United, second half for Barnsley. But then I saw, I think, probably the greatest player I've ever seen live. And I saw Pelé, but unfortunately Pelé was injured when he was playing against Hungary in 1966. But I saw Duncan Edwards, who I think is easily the best player I've ever seen. I've never seen a man had so much composure, time. He was called the big man. He was 5'11", but 14 stone, and looked like Gerrard. But what a player! The starting point, of course, in Bradford is, of course, in the late 18th century. Bradford was a community of, 3,000 people. And it was mainly weavers, some spinners, and combers, because Bradford developed as a combing centre. And that's a 7-year apprenticeship. That's quite a skilled thing, because you need to comb out the long strands for the worsted. It doesn't matter for wool, you mat it, but for worsted you need that. And it developed there, but gradually things began to change in the late 18th century. To begin with, Bradford would be organised by a wool stapler who would buy wool and worsted, would give it out to a spinner, spun, then to a weaver, etc., and then pass it on to a merchant and sell it. But gradually that trade changed, because what happened is spinning became mechanised. And eventually by 1820, that's in 1780s, 90s, combing became mechanised, the Big Ben comb, Cartwright, 1799. 1820, thereabouts, weaving became mechanised. So gradually it became mechanised. And the real problems are that as it became mechanised, it became more impersonalised and less directly controlled. Because in the 19th century, in the 18th century and early 19th century, there had been controls on workers' organisations, combination acts. There were 30 or 40, if not more of them, which were brought together in 1799 and 1800 there are combination laws, but they brought the combination acts together so that any organisation that was formed would be automatic combination. The trouble is, weavers form one, right, you have to pass a law. The spinners form one, you have to pass a law. It's so they combine them together. And the controls in Bradford were through the Worsted Committee, formed in 1777 to stop spinners, weavers or whatever, decamping, taking away, giving back less than they'd received in wool or yarn or whatever. But and there were some unions that tried to protest against that, but they were very shady. There was a body called the Institution. Keeps getting referred to. Nobody realised any material on the Institution. It appears in a commission 1803 to 6, the Institution. And in South Yorkshire, the miners are organised under the Black Lamp. But we really get very little about it. So there's very little organisation. But increasingly, the mechanisation began to change the nature of the trade. Combers began to become threatened by machinery. And so combers, threatened by machinery, Big Ben and other things, and gig workers, people who are cutting their cloth, they formed the basis of Luddism in 1812, 13, 14. Gradually, unions begin to form, but it's very shady because they are illegal. They're not a legal body. And in 1824, a body of 37 weavers form a union in Manningham. And they form, it's called the Union to begin with. And in 1825, they call for not wage increases, although people often refer to that. What they refer to is the need to equalise wages for weavers and woolcombers. And the result was that a person called John Tester led them in industrial action from June to November, about 23 weeks or something like that, in 1825. And they got a lot of support. It raised about £15,000, about £600 from Bradford, £1,100 or £1,200 from London, different parts of the country came in. And generally speaking, it's argued that 2,000 or 3,000 children and perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 adults were affected in that strike. You get all sorts of different figures, but that tends to be the thing, wild exaggerations, whatever. Now that strike was not successful. Well, it wasn't successful in getting equalisation of wages. What it did, it was to get the union recognised. And they didn't get wage increases, they didn't get equalisation of wages. And that in 1825, that was the situation. What happened after that is that within a few months, unemployment had increased in Bradford, and people like John Tester left to find work elsewhere. And the union struggled on. I think it done a very small strike in 1827, but it struggled on for 2 or 3 years and then just collapsed. But that's not unusual because, I was thinking of the Saddleworth weavers. I had documents somewhere on them. Thank goodness I got some photocopies somewhere on them because they can't find their records now. But they were formed in 1828 and collapsed in 1830 because, as the one account says, there was much money in there, and the officials, effectively, they're arguing that they decamped with the money. They had no bad time of it, I think is the actual phrase. And that's one of the problems, you see. One of the problems of unions, if you're not legal bodies, you can't protect your funds. You can't take, as a union, you can't take somebody to court, your treasurer to court, for running off with the money because you're not a legal body. Which is why unions, when they began to emerge, often used to put their money from an individual to perhaps somebody running a pub, a publican. And then you've got an individual claim against the publican if he goes off with the money. But if you were a trade union and doing that, you have no rights. Now, really what happened after the 1825 strike is you've got a few thousand workers organising from time to time, but Bradford never has many. Those who organise tend to be engineers and other groups rather than textile workers. The wool sorters were formed in 1834, and wool sorting, a very dirty trade, very dangerous because of the infections you can get from wool. They were formed in 1834, and they were reasonably successful because they had you had the skilled wool sorters and then people who were less skilled and less refined sorting of wool. But I remember in 1968 or 9 sending a letter to them because they were near the old Chester Street bus station in Bradford. They didn't reply. Sent another letter, didn't reply. Then I was in the library. I thought I'll walk round. Yeah, pity you didn't come 2 weeks ago. We destroyed everything except this document when we started. So the records were destroyed. But the wool sorters were there. You got in the 1850s, 50s and early 60s, engineers forming, for instance, small engineering unions forming. And some were involved in the 1851 strike nationally, later on the 1897. But, there's not a great deal on those. And the other group in Bradford that formed were the typographers. Now, typography or printing was very important because it's not only the newspapers. Bradford, after the interest developed in cards, and obviously Christmas cards, became a big area for the season, for 3 or 4 months a year. You're producing Christmas cards and everything else. It was a big area. And in the 1860s, they begin to form. But it's quite clear that in the case of the typographers, they don't really have that much power. In 1867, they meet the employers in Laycox. Well, it's called something else then. Laycock's Firths, it had another name, I can't remember what the name was, but Laycock's in Bradford. Now, Laycock's is where the Independent Labour Party, or the Bradford Labour Union, was formed. And it's just, the old market, where the old market used to be, became Golden Lion Chinese in the 1960s, then it became an Italian, and now it's just in a ruined state. But they met in Laycock's, which was the meeting hall in Bradford. J.B. Priestley used to organise his literary events in Laycock's. Laycock's Firths, and forgot the other name for them. There were three. Went through three names. And they met them in 1867, and it's quite clear, it's interesting. The employers' names are listed, but the employees do not list their names. It's trying to get some sort of two things, I suppose. One is a standardisation of wages, and secondly, some control over new machinery that's coming in. And it's quite clear that if you talk about them, they are fairly active. Some of their leaders, Edward Roche, James Bartley, were leading figures in the 1880s, 1890s in the formation of the Independent Labour Party, and hence the early Labour Party. The problem with them, dealing with strikes with them, it's very difficult to measure their strike activity because they're organised into chapels. And a strike in typography with the typographers means that you withdraw labour from a particular printing house, often because they've employed their apprentices in your place. So these strikes can go on for months, years. It's just that in a sense, you're blacking the particular printing establishment. So it's very difficult. I wrote a short book with Jack Reynolds on the printers, the typographers, the Bradford typographers. And you can't really talk about any real strikes except in 1897 when the Thorn machine is brought in and so forth. So you've got that. But the other development, as far as Bradford was concerned, is 1868, the Bradford Trades Council was formed. And a couple of thousand people, and then it collapsed and was reformed in 1872. But it was never a very strong organisation. It fell to perhaps 1,500 members by 1886, the low point of trade unionism in Britain at that time, having reached 1 million or more. There's only about 500,000 trade unionists in Britain by 1886. So, it's going with that. And these are skilled workers. The ordinary textile worker isn't really organised. So you've got dyers, you've got stuff pressers, you've got skip and basket makers, who are obviously important in the trade. And so it's a very small body, usually politically, of course, liberals. There's a lot of them. Samuel Shafto, secretary and then president for many years, was a member of the Liberal Party and a former of the Liberal Electoral Association in 1887, which was there to get working men into the Liberal Party. So it's difficult, and they weren't very, it's a precarious existence for them. But what begins to occur nationally, and also in Bradford and Leeds and other areas, is in late 1880s, you've got what the Webbs called new unionism. Whether it was or not is a matter of debate, but what it was organising people who weren't skilled or semi-skilled. Now, what had begun to happen in the 1880s for the first time, in 1884, the Spen area, the Batley, Dewsbury and Huddersfield, there was a formation of a union, the West Riding Power Loom Weavers Association, which became the General Union. It went through various titles until it became the National Union of Textile Workers in the time of the First World War. And what happened is that there was a big strike. They got some concessions, not much really. And obviously there's union organisation beginning to occur. So part and parcel by the late 1880s was the growth of new unionism, the semi-skilled and unskilled workers getting together. The result was the growth of trade unionism in Bradford, as with the rest of the country. You probably had 3,000 people in the Trades Council in 1888. You had about 10,000 in 1892. And what happened is that these trade unions increasingly became susceptible to socialist influence because they could point out that the employers couldn't care less. You know, John Field, a printer, in 1888 was preferred by the Liberals to Sam Shafter, who was a Liberal, the Trades Council president, was preferred. And John Field was an unfair employer. He didn't pay trade union rates. So, yeah, you know, that gives you the sort of sense. And this sort of thing was happening on a small sort of scale elsewhere. So when the Independent Labour Party was formed in Bradford as the Bradford Labour Union in 1891 and so forth, they began to drift in that way. But what really gave the stimulus to Bradford trade unionism wasn't just that. It was in 1890 to 91, December 1890 to April 1891, there was the biggest strike in Bradford and area for a long time, the Manningham Mill strike. Now, Manningham Mills, if you know Bradford, is a dominating feature of the landscape. And it's now, I think, been turned into flats, but it was a place which employed, say, 3,000 people, perhaps up to 15,000 in the First World War, but about 3,000, mainly doing worsted and silk, and therefore you produce velveteens, you know, silk, you know, velvet, basic velveteens, high quality material. Now you've got to remember, most mills in Bradford are not large. You've got Salts on the outskirts of Bradford, Saltaire. You've got you've got Manningham Mills, but you've also Samuel and Lifter, but you've also the Illingworths, who became ultimately later on Illingworth Morris, but they had the Wetley Mills and so forth. And you've got to remember, some of these firms, you know, are built up. I mean, Daniel Illingworth set up Illingworths in 1820 odd, and he was a worker. He almost worked alongside people. You know, his workers. There wasn't that distinction until 1825 to 30, with that collapse of the relationship. That's when Bishop Blaise Fair, you know, everybody used to go to Bishop Blaise, 1825, February 1832, 1 7-year septennial, never occurred. So things had changed. But these big mills were employed a few thousand. The average worsted mill employed about 70, and the average woolen mill about 30. So, you know, it's untypical. These are untypical of what was in Bradford. There were a few larger mills, but by and large, it's small mill material. Now, Manningham Mills was the biggest, and Samuel Cunliffe Lister introduced his own machines, the Lister nip and on-combing and so forth, built up that mill from the 1870s. It burnt down in the 1870s, they rebuilt it, and it's Manningham Mills you know today. And what happened is that with Lister, a lot of his trade was to America. Now in 1890, they got to know that the Americans would be introducing tariffs, the McKinley tariff. There was the Wilson tariff and then the McKinley. But the McKinley sort of added 50% to the cost of goods going in because of the tax. So what Lister did, who became Lord Massam later on, what Lister did was to, you know, build up that mills, everybody producing overtime the lot to get stuff into America before the tariff comes down. And the minute the tariff came down in December 1890, suddenly it's 15 to 25% wage reductions in one fell swoop. Now, like Salts, there were a few unions that came from time to time, silk unions, but they disappeared. In Manningham, there'd been the odd union came and flitted in and flitted out. And they weren't organised. But what they did was to force out one section of the workers and then another until it built it up to try to break the strike. But what happened is that the general union, as it became, the West Riding Power Loom Weavers, decided to come in and organise the workers. And they were led by a chap called W.H. True. And I have a picture, I don't know if it would come out of him. Here's a picture of a meeting with the ILP. And you've got Ben Tillett, the trade unionist there. You've got Fred Jowett. You've got Tom Mann, and you got W.H. Drew. You've got some of the leading figures. Now, W.H. Drew, down there, I don't know if you can see him, was the organiser. And what he did was to really get the workers organised, because there were great difficulties. You couldn't, the employers and who were represented on the council stopped the workers meeting in various halls. There was a place called the Star Music Hall. They were going to meet there. No, you'll lose your licence if you allow these workers in. So there was a lot of that. And so they had open air meetings at Peckover Drive area, Peckover, and they were stopped, and it was a class conflict there. Now, what happened is that the strikers were out for 19 weeks, and at the end of the dispute, there was disturbances. There was a meeting at St George's Hall where Tom Mann, Ben Tillett, the great trade union leaders of the day, Keir Hardie, all attended in April. I think it's about 15th or 16th. Anyway, mid-April. And then there was supposed to be a meeting outside, gathering outside. Now, the place where they gathered used to be called, I'm not sure if it's still called that, Norfolk Gardens, but it was originally known as Dockers Square. And it's between the Town Hall and St George's Hall. It's that section which they're pedestrianising now. And there was a meeting there. Well, the police tried to break it up. Was it Chief Constable Withers, and others tried to break it up, but they haven't enough numbers. So they bring in the military from Manchester and other areas. And the Riot Act is read. And Edward Roche, who was a typographer and ILPer and that, said it was like they chased people with fixed bayonets up. I think he's exaggerating, but he said that. In fixed bayonets up Ivegate in Bradford. It's like scenes from the French Revolution. Anyway, that died down and the workers were effectively forced back. But really what happened is that leading the figures like W.H. Drew, George Minty, James Bartley, a chap called Willie Leach, who became a member of the Labour government in 1924. These sort of people decided that they would form a political Labour union called the Bradford Labour Union in May 1891 at Laycock's, off Hearths or whatever. I think it was Laycock's at the time. They kept changing their name. There's a beautiful quote, and that is, there have been two parties in the past. The can'ts, that's the Liberals because Home Rule comes first, and the won'ts, that's the Conservatives. Time that we had a party that will, the ILP Labour Party as it became. And so really the Trades Council became very much dominated very quickly by the ILP, Independent Labour Party. By 1892 it's really representative. Later on there's a division in the sense that the Trades Council forms the Workers' Municipal Federation, the RP are separate, but they work together. They are the same people, at large. So they work together. And so really in the 1890s, the Manningham Mill strike, I think Edward Palmer Thompson once said that in fact the Manningham Mill strike was the beginning of the political Labour movement, the Independent Labour Party. In defeat there was victory. And, that was the case, I think. And so there's a tremendous growth until the mid-90s of the trade union movement in Bradford. It was by the late 1890s, there were problems. They tried to raise issues like there was a Will Salters report, 1897, which showed you appalling conditions that they worked in 120 degrees and so forth, unbearable conditions. And so forth. Now, in terms of strikes, I mean, I suppose the next major strike that would afflict Bradford would be the engineers. And that's the Engineering Amalgamated Society of Engineering strike in 1897. And, basically it was the employers forcing on new machinery. And I suppose in the end, the engineers were really defeated, I suppose, really. I mean, they got some concessions, but by and large it was a defeat. And remember, the engineers are probably the best placed workers. I mean, the highest paid workers in Bradford would be the engineers, 24 shillings to £2 or £3. The only ones that would exceed them in really prosperous times would be the typographers, who could earn £2 to £3 a week if trade was really very good. So if you beat the engineers, then it's a difficult situation. And it's not surprising that people like Tom Mann tried to organise. There was a section in Bradford, Halifax, etc., the Workers' Union. He formed the Workers' Union for the unskilled, and that Workers' Union went on for many years. There's a brilliant book on it. But anyway, so that really, in a sense, what was occurring. In Bradford, you've got to remember there's a fallback, but when you look at trade unionism in Bradford, you're looking at skilled unions by and large. The most, it's the engineers, it's the typographers, it's the, skip and basket makers, it's that sort of thing. When you actually come to the textile workers, the average spinner and weaver is not unionised. Weavers are more likely to be unionised than spinners, because a lot of the spinners are women. And increasingly, a lot of, you are talking 2,000 or 3,000, well, actually only talking a few thousand for the West Riding. The General Union, as it became, the West Riding power loom operators, who became the General Union, 10, 20,000. Well, you've got 250,000 people or more to organise, and it is small. So it's always weak. And that's the feature, really, of textile unions rather than skilled sections. The dyers might get a few thousand workers, 3, 4, 5, 6,000, etc. So then we come on, really, in a sense, when you get strikes, the small scale, the employers often win, I think, rather than the trade unionists. And then we come on to the First World War. And in the First World War, there was obviously a demand for wool and for wosteds of uniforms, whatever. And wool control, of course, was set up in Bradford. If you go past Forster Street station, up the hill, past the hotel, Midland, and then just go to the top there, where roads used to come together, and there was a pointed building at the end. There's a building on the right-hand side. Last time I went, it may have been knocked down now, which was wool control. G.H. Wood, the statistician, Wood Burley Statistics. G.H. Wood, who came from Huddersfield and he was in control of it. But what happened is people felt, obviously, there was a need to produce for the war. And coal was taken over, wool was controlled, etc. And what happened is that J.H. Whitley, MP for Halifax, one of the 2 MPs for Halifax, later on Assistant Speaker and then Speaker of the House of Commons, he put forward a scheme which became known as the Whitley Councils. Now, not many developed anywhere. Civil service kept them for years. There were some in one part of the building trade for a time, but textiles operated through Whitley Council from 1916 to the 1930s, when it more or less collapsed. The idea was to bring employers and employees together, or their representatives together, to conciliate or arbitrate on disputes. And in the wartime situation, that worked reasonably well, because you got people being paid, and then there was a war bonus because of inflation, etc. But after the war, most of that began to collapse. In 1920-21, the Whitley Councils presided over reductions in the wage rates, which are very complex in textiles. Nobody ever really understood them. Not even the people who looked into them later on. But there was sort of 5% down on that sort of thing. And 20 or 21, I think, was the last reduction. And then there was nothing. The Whitley Council arbitrated on various things in textiles until 1926 or 25, when the dispute occurred. What happened is that in 1925, there was a desire by the government to return to the gold standard. In the First World War, we'd gone off free trade and therefore gold standard. Payments in gold, transferring from one vault in the City of London to another, or the Bank of England to another. And what happened is that when Churchill introduced the return to the gold standard after 7 years, he did it, but he did it at the wrong rate. You know, the value of the pound before the war being 4.86 to the dollars to the pound. It had gone to 2.86, aimed to get back at 4.86, but it was only 4.46. So he took it back at 4.86. The meaning of that is very simple. You're selling goods to foreign countries, but you're asking for 10% more. Your prices are higher. And of course that created problems in the coal industry, which is why the coal miners were threatened with reductions in 1925, which ultimately in its way led to the 1976 general strike. But also, the same in the textile industry. There was a desire to cut the wages. And the employers came in basically, I suppose it's a fight, it's difficult to get the price things, but basically with a reduction. Well, the unions wanted an increase, and the employers wanted a decrease of 5%. And the Whitley Council discusses these in 24 and 25, but obviously, sorry, in 24 and then 25, but they're going nowhere with it. You know, there's no, the Whitley Council doesn't seem to be working very well, and if you're constantly having cuts, you're not going to trust that arbitration, that conciliation, are you? If it's all one way, one side's going to say, hey up, enough's enough. And really, in a sense, that's what occurred. And then it all built up a few months after the return to the gold standard. At the same time, in fact, the very day that the lockouts were announced, I'll come back to those, 5 unions, stuff pressers and the various things, all came together to form a new organisation. A new trade union. Prior to that, the National Union of Textile Workers had been formed a few years before to bring some of these organisations together. Also, there was an association, the National Association of United Textile Trades, which went beyond wool. It was woolen, worsted and wool, and also cotton. So really, in a sense, you had a building up of amalgam. So you're getting trade unions beginning to organise better. You're getting employers wanting a wage reduction. You're getting the Whitley Council not working. And what happens is that eventually the employers announce it's announced on the 24th of July that in fact they will put on the gates of the textile mills the announcement of a lockout. Well, basically, don't come to work unless you accept these new conditions. It's a Friday, so the actual strike really starts on a Monday, properly on a Monday. And what we have is what is referred to often as a 1925 wool strike, which is actually, correctly, a wool lockout. Workers aren't striking. The employers are locking them out unless they accept new conditions. And immediately, the first estimates are 132, 138,000 workers are out, mainly in Bradford. Bradford, to begin with, was given 80,000 as its figure. A week later, it's down to 50,000. Halifax, 10,000, and so forth. It comes to about, I think it's 132 or 138, but the 2 or 3 sets of figures appear, and they're all slightly different. Later on, they discriminate between workers who are out of work and those employers who have not imposed the new conditions. So in Bradford, 50,000 by the end of July, 50,000 workers are out, but 10,000 are still in work because their notices have not been issued. And so what you've got is a dispute on. Now, there's a little bit of violence here and there in Canal Road, etc., Union Mills and other areas in Bradford, but not a lot. It's a very well organised strike. And the main point about it, I mean, it's led, the figure who was the leading figure in it, leading the what is the General Union, keeps changing its name, but the General Union is, of course, Ben Turner, later on Sir Ben Turner of Dewsbury, who became president of the Trade Union Congress in the late 20s, and he gives his name to the Turner-Mond talks between the TUC and the big companies, big companies in the 1928, really, that sort of period. Now, Ben Turner is the leading figure, but there are other people, Harris Hoyle, a chap called Dawson, Arthur Dawson, and all sorts of different people. There are attempts to bring this conflict together. The main ones are made a couple of times by a chap called J.H. Palin. Now, you may not have heard of him, but Palin worked in Bradford. He was a general labourer and then a railway man. He was president of the Amalgamated Society of Railway Servants in 1900-1901, who were found guilty by the House of Lords introduced the Taff Vale Judgment, when thereafter, if you came out on strike, the union would have to pay the losses of the employers. So he was a very important person. He became MP. He was very important. He was the one who in 1914 made a very famous speech about the Independent Labour Party, its 21st year. Of ordinary historical association, Bradford has none. In Doomsday Book it was described as a waste, but successive periods of capitalist exploitation have done little to improve it. But in 1922 he became an MP for Newcastle East. In 1925 at the time, I don't know how I combined the duties, he was actually Mayor of Bradford. And so he must have been a councillor, a mayor, or became a mayor, and was still an MP. And it's a big, important person, Palin, P-A-L-I-N. And he tried to bring the sides together. It didn't work. Ultimately, what happened is that chap called Leggett, representing the government, brought the two sides together about the 10th of August. By the 15th, 16th of August, there's an agreement that they will set up a commission of investigation to examine the situation, and effectively the lockouts are called off. In between time, of course, a lot of employers haven't been involved, and some employers have actually said, look, we'll withdraw our notices. There've also been, in the meantime, lots of meetings at Savile Park and other areas in Halifax, at Fairweather Green, but in Bradford, at Peckovers and so forth. There's been lots of meetings. And the result eventually was a commission set up, I think it's August the 17th. It meets September the 21st, 2nd, 3rd, and one day in October. And sometime in mid-October, it produces its reports. 3 volumes of it. I have looked at them. And I understand what Philip Snowden said, because there were representatives, not directly involved in each side, representatives for the employers and the workers. Philip Snowden was one of the representatives for the worker side, who became Chancellor of the Exchequer. Well, he was 24 and 29 to 31 for the Labour government. E.F. Wise, a statistician, economist, expert at Oxford, ILP of the lot, was another. And they looked at this material, and I concur with what Snowden said. It's unintelligible how to work out the wage rates in textiles. If you've got day employment, that's easy, but most of it is by piece, length, thinness, and so forth. You know, if you're in cotton, because cotton's involved, you know, the finer the cotton, you're going to get more mileage out of a pound of cotton. It's more difficult to bring out that thread, because that thread is likely to break. You need skilled people to do it. And it is complex. And I looked through the records, and I agree with what was said. You know, we cannot come to a conclusion. We can't understand the system. So the conclusion of this arbitration was, leave it as it is. And in a sense, the point about that is that probably 132, 138,000, not the 250,000, because not everybody was out, workers who were involved, their conditions were not changed. They weren't improved, but they weren't changed. And you've got to think about the same time what's happening. Two things are happening. One is that apart from the wool, well, there's the wool strike, wool lockout, I should say, lockout rather than strike. Everybody calls it strike, I don't know why. The success there, and it's occurring, remember, at the same time as the coal miners, the attempt by the coal owners to reduce the wages of the miners by 10%. Now that was smoothed over because the government came with this in a subsidy on the 31st of July 1925, which is often referred to as Red Friday. But it sets up a commission and 9-month subsidy, and of course 9 months later you've got the coal dispute begins again and the general strike. So it was occurring at an important point. And then you've got the wool, and remember the coal miners are tremendously well organised. The vast majority, 90-odd%, if not more, are in unions. If they're in employment, they are in unions. There was probably 100,000 who weren't in unions because they weren't in employment, but they are well organised. You look at the textile workers, badly organised, but they've succeeded. They fought off the attempt by the employers to reduce their wages. In the wake of that, by the end of 25, the TUC says, we've had two great victories against the wage reductions that have gone on since the First World War. And those wage reductions have been fought off. The greatest victories in recent trade union history, that sort of thing. That's the sort of statements they're making. And so they produce a journal, a new journal, called Trade Union Unity. And the article in the first, one of the articles in the first edition was written by Alderman Ben Turner, later Sir Ben Turner, president to become of the TUC, etc. And it said, basically it's saying, if a badly organised union like ours, or trade like ours, can beat off the employers, anybody can do it. And the whole theme was unity. Now, during the coal lockout, coal dispute, because it didn't come to that, the miners at the same time provided some money, loans and money, for the wool workers who were out, because obviously I think there's something like 30 or 40,000 pounds they have to raise to keep people going, to provide some strike pay. And that sort of established, I think, a link between the textile workers and other groups in Bradford and the coal mining community. So in 1926, we have, 9 months later, we have the end of the subsidy. The coal owners demand wage reductions and lengthening of hours. The TUC on the 3rd of May, or minute to midnight, on the 3rd of May, announce that they announced a day or two before, but the general strike, or a strike in support of a national strike in support of the coal miners. It was never referred to as a general strike, although that became the term that people used, because the general strike has revolutionary connotations, which they didn't want. What happens is you'll find that the textile workers in Bradford are never called out. They're not seen as the vital workers. They're second-line workers. The first-line workers, the printers, the railway men are called out in support of the miners. They're never called out. But what happens is that a lot of textile workers are actually come out. They're advised to go back. The Trades Council try to keep control, but they're not called out, but they do come out, and they do provide some financial support for the miners. So, there is an involvement, even though it's not a strike, textile strike, in 1926. And in fact, it reminds me of the interview I did in 1979 with a young man. He was at time at 14. I've got to say, when I interviewed him on the general strike, he wanted to talk about his days helping to develop the Spitfire at Sutton Bank. But anyway, I managed to get him off that, had to talk about that. And he said, well, I was a young man at the time. He said, all I can remember is the first day of the strike. Suddenly, there's no public transport. I've got to walk up to Laybourn in Bradford and that. And this car came up. I've never been in a car in my life. This bloke says, do you want a lift? I went into it. And he said, I got to top of Laybourn there, and there were people there stopping the movement and flow and throwing stones and whatever. And he said, the driver suddenly said, oh, they got me eye. And I looked there, blood, empty socket. Then he said, I realised it hit him there and it had knocked his false eye out. But then I said, what happened next? He said, well, I told me, Dad, I've been at a car today. He says, you're a bloody strike breaker. And I said, what happened next? He said, he got his belt out and belted me arse. So that was the comment there. But there was still a sort of involvement of textile workers quite clearly taking unofficial action in 26. In the general strike of 26, 3rd to the 12th of May 26, officially, all that would come out in Bradford really would be the printers who came out and the railway workers. And so that's all you would have in the strike. But there was some violence connected more broadly with textile workers and other groups. The third group would come out of the power workers. And so really since they came out, and indeed the power station was blacked and I think effectively stopped. Because you don't have the power workers, you don't have trams. Trams can't operate with that. And so that's what occurred. There was not a great deal of, it was more sympathetic support. There was some action. I've seen pictures of 1 or 2 trams that operated by the employers managing to operate them. One burnt out near Church Hill in Bradford, near the cathedral somewhere. So I've seen a picture of that. So there was a little bit of violence in that respect. But by and large, it was peaceful in Bradford. And I say Church Hill because it's a church hill. So really, in a sense, there was that sort of support. And there was a lot of frustration. I mean, in Bradford, the Trades Council operated, I suppose the person who really ran the Trades Council at that time, well, in the 1890s, a man who took over leadership on the Trades Council was a chap called Walter Barber. There was Arthur Sewell, who was the treasurer, and other people. Walter Barber, brought in as assistant secretary and eventually took over as secretary, his son, Revis Barber. And it's Revis Barber who tried to organise proper picketing by the groups in Bradford. And I think Bradford was reasonably quiet. Given that, by and large, coal areas would be quiet because you're not going to, break the strike in a coal area. When the threat is to throw you down the shaft, it's not going to occur. So in Barnes and that, Winston Churchill once wrote a piece in the British Gazette, disturbances in Barnsley. There were no disturbances in Barnsley. It's all fiction. Where you're likely to get conflict is where there's areas like Bradford, which are not specifically coal areas. But there was really very little in Bradford. But the leading figure in that was Revis Barber. And I don't know if you know Bradford well enough, but when I was at Bradford University in the 60s, they had 2 halls of residence, one called David Bellamy, the other called Revis Barber. So, and he was there for many years. But it was sympathetic support, organising some picketing by the groups that were affected, and also involved in trying to avoid, after the general strike was called off, because you're going out, the dyers, for instance, were forced into an agreement that they would never strike again. Well, they signed it, but ignored it. This odious document as it's often referred to. So really, that's what happened in Bradford. So it's not a centre of the general strike, except it's, it's an area where there's a lot of support for the miners and for the action of the TUC. Well, I mean, there were a few women involved. I mean, not specifically in Bradford, but born in Bradford and active. One woman that was involved certainly in Bradford and out of Bradford is buried is Julia Varley, buried in Eccles Hill Cemetery. But many years ago, we are talking 25, 30 years ago, if not more, there used to be a group called the West Bowling Women's Group or something like that. And we are talking probably the 70s, 80s, might be nearly 40 years, 70s, early 80s. And I went to interview them. And a lot of these women were in their 70s and 80s. And I asked them about the 20s and the 30s. And they talked about supporting the wool dispute. They talked about the general strike and their involvement and trying to raise money and support. They also talked about unemployment, because that was a constant problem. One of the things you should say is that unemployment in textiles is rather different. It's by the piece. You take a piece out for worsted production, and then once you've finished it, you wait for the next contract. It's not, you're on this week and off next week. It's that sort of thing. So unemployment was quite a common thing. And of course, a lot of women were in the textile trade. And I always remember them. They sang, and this is why I would have liked the tape, and that they sang a song on unemployment. Are you unemployed? So am I. And it went on in that fashion, And so there were women involved, certainly. You've got, if you take the wider Labour movement, obviously women like Ellen Wilkinson came to Bradford to support the movement, etc. But, they're rarely in the top positions, but they are there and present and active.